Go back 200 years. Then imagine a place where the sun is shining most of the time and the weather is pleasantly warm. This place would have blue skies as far as the eye could decipher. The deep blue sea would stretch to the horizon on one side, and on the opposite side, its water's edge would lap upon the soft, sandy shore with cool, curling waves. Now think of that shore as a long, flat, crescent beach carved out from nearby bluffs, as if crafted by God's own hands. Underneath that beckoning beach and that crystal ocean foam would exist a supply of accessible petroleum that could fuel a region for at least 100 years. Welcome to Long Beach, California. In 1542, a European traveler set foot upon the Long Beach shore for the first time. Portuguese captain Juan Cabrillo was sailing for Spain when he encountered native people in the Bay of Smokes. The smoke hanging over the bay most likely originated from signal fires set by the local Tongva tribe. After this initial landing, 60 years passed until the next European explorer found the bay in 1602. At that time, Sebastian Vizcaino was attempting to establish ports of refuge for Spanish galleons loaded with treasures en route from the Philippines to Mexico. Another 132 years would elapse before Spanish sea captain José Cabrera Bueno became inspired in 1734 to name the bay San Pedro in honor of St. Peter, the Bishop of Alexandria. One more century would expire by 1835, when Richard Henry Dana landed in the area as a merchant sailor. Dana eventually would write a literary classic titled 2 Years Before the Mast. The book included descriptions of the arduous life of nautical fur traders navigating the San Pedro Bay. The first time the American Navy took significant interest in the San Pedro Bay occurred during the Mexican-American War of 1846. Commodore Robert Stockton landed in the bay and left an aggressive and brash lieutenant in charge. Accompanied by a meager force of 17 Marines, Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie captured Los Angeles without firing a shot. However, his arrogant manner goaded the otherwise peaceful Mexican heritage Californios who were living at the ranchos. Lieutenant Gillespie's condescension unwittingly incited the rancho dwellers to take a stand against the U.S. government. Militant skirmishes took place between the locals and the subsequent American forces which landed in the area. A buried cannon was dug up and then was fired at the U.S. troops in one conflict, killing at least 4 and wounding several others. Ultimately, Mexico ceded California to the U.S. government in 1848. About 30 years later, a dreamer and a visionary originally from England stumbled upon the Long Beach area while on a quest to visit the new wine-producing colony of Anaheim. William Irwin Wilmore proved to be a more successful idealist than he was a businessman. Wilmore ventured his best efforts to develop a new village, but ran out of time because of a lack of resources, difficult payment terms on his contract with the Bixby family of landowners, and poor timing. After the name of the settlement changed from the American Colony and Wilmore City to its final name, Long Beach, development slowly started to flourish. Then, in 1901, another visionary arrived. This time, the visionary possessed the deep pocket resources and the marketing and business acumen necessary to effectively change the community forever. Wealthy Tucson, Arizona transplant Colonel Charles Rivers Drake retired in Long Beach and spent the next 25 years investing his time, energy, and ample fortune developing the Long Beach shore for amusement and tourism. He created the Pike, also known as the Walk of 1,000 Lights, and the Long Beach Bathhouse, later known as the Plunge. Charles Drake also built the luxurious 5-star Hotel Virginia and the related Virginia Country Club.
The Bixbys were subdivided the rancho basically and sold parcels. Drake saw the tourism possibilities and really made the town, rather than just a town, into a kind of a spectacular tourist attraction.
Drake eventually shared the beachfront with another connoisseur of seaside entertainment, Charles Loof. Loof demonstrated the technical skills of a mechanic combined with the soul of an artist. He was America's foremost carousel maker and designed the first carousel on Coney Island. In 1910, Charles Loof purchased seafront property in Long Beach. He built the wildly popular Long Beach Hippodrome merry-go-round in 1911. Charles Loof continued building carousels and amusement park rides from his home base in Long Beach until his death in 1918. Meanwhile, Colonel Charles Drake used his contacts and business friendship with railroad baron Henry Huntington to bring the Pacific Electric Rail line to Long Beach. The first Pacific Electric red car arrived during the 4th of July holiday in 1902. The arrival was timed exquisitely with the simultaneous opening of the new bathhouse at the Pike. Nearly 60,000 visitors flocked to Long Beach on that July 4th. For a city with less than 3,000 residents, it became clear Long Beach was destined to grow at breakneck pace. During the next 4 decades, it held the reputation as the fastest-growing city in America.
That day was one of the turning points in Long Beach history, was the arrival of the Pacific Electric red car line. Because before that, a train only came into town twice a day. That was, the regular train line. But after that, cars were running every 20 minutes.
Shipbuilding and the development of the Port of Long Beach were the next ventures to drive commerce and trade to the city. John Franklin Craig relocated the Craig Shipbuilding Company from Toledo, Ohio, to the mudflats of Long Beach in 1907. The Craig Company was the first to build steel steamships in Southern California, launching a steel freighter in December of 1910. Concurrently, the Port of Long Beach officially began operations in June of 1911. The port expedited the delivery of raw materials such as lumber from the Northwest to facilitate rapid-paced construction. Around the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. Navy developed more interest in the Southern California coast. A few Navy ships and squadrons anchored in the local water at various times prior to 1907, the year when President Theodore Roosevelt ordered the Great White Fleet on a worldwide tour. The fleet appeared in the San Pedro Bay in April of 1908, greeted by as many as 50,000 onlookers. The highly celebrated event foreshadowed the return of the dreadnaughts in 1919, when President Woodrow Wilson designated the bay as the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet Battleship Group. In the early 20s, Long Beach welcomed the commerce and related opportunities the Navy delivered to the city. Access to privately owned repair shops and shipbuilding facilities operating in Long Beach and next door San Pedro provided additional incentive for the Navy to locate the battle fleet in the San Pedro Bay. The 1920s heralded a period of tremendous wealth and prosperity for Long Beach. The Pike had become well established as a mecca for amusement in Southern California. The seafront portion of the city had been labeled the Queen of the Beaches, and the port had developed into a thriving center of trade. A geological blessing in the discovery of oil in 1921 meant that Long Beach was not only the fastest growing city in America, but also the wealthiest city of its size.
A lot of people don't realize that there was a recession in the United States after World War I, and the discovery of oil lured more people here than you could imagine.
By the end of the 1920s, the Navy assigned hundreds of officers and thousands of sailors to the area.
The Navy was a huge economic presence for the city, and I think the city really identified as a Navy town.
In the 1930s, the Navy continued expanding its fleet operations in the San Pedro Bay. By 1932, Long Beach claimed the title Navy Capital of the United States because more Navy families lived there than anywhere else in the nation. Fleet personnel numbered more than 30,000 in 1935, with 15 battleships and 20 heavy cruisers in port, along with an escort entourage. supplies and provisions flowed rapidly through the Navy landing to the awaiting ships. Hungry crews on Navy vessels consumed 50,000 pounds of beef and 35,000 cartons of eggs each month. In spite of all the activity, there was no official government-owned Navy base facility and no Navy-operated dry dock for ship repair. Consequently, with war clouds gathering on the horizon in the late 30s, Congress passed funded legislation to construct a permanent base, including a dry dock.
The Navy here and the Navy base had a huge impact on Long Beach. I mean, it was one of the most positive things that happened to this city. And in the old days, when Time Magazine, New York Times wrote about Long Beach, they would talk about how it's an oil town and it's a Navy town.
Two California firms began base construction in 1940, utilizing the architectural and engineering services provided by Allied engineers. Acclaimed architect Paul Revere Williams organized and led the Allied Engineers Company. Roosevelt Base was named for sitting President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
It was supposed to have been built along the lines of the one at Pearl Harbor, but they enlarged it to take into account any ship then sailing the seas or any ship then contemplated being built. Yeah, it was the largest in the world.
The new base included administrative headquarters, housing for officers and sailors, recreational facilities, and training resources. Its recreational facilities were some of the finest of any U.S. naval installation. They included the Allen Center Officers Club, the Stark Center for Enlisted Men, a gymnasium, a swimming pool, outdoor playing fields, and several other amenities. An official base commissioning ceremony occurred on September 1, 1942, 9 months after the Pearl Harbor attack. A large portion of Roosevelt Base was designated as the Small Craft Training Center. This command supervised training in the intricacies of operating small crafts such as PT boats, submarine chasers, minesweepers, and mine layers. Accurate target shooting practice was possible just a few miles offshore in conditions that mimicked those of the South Pacific. After World War II, the Long Beach base remained the center for training in oceanic mine warfare tactics. The Naval Operating Base encompassed numerous facility operations and nearby outposts, including Reeves Field, an airstrip on Terminal Island. Other operations included a naval weapons depot in Seal Beach, a state-of-the-art naval hospital in Long Beach, and an Air Reserve training base in nearby Los Alamitos. Reeves Field was active 24/7 during the war years, ferrying pilots and delivering new planes from aircraft plants. One of the transport planes flew a total of 76 times in 1 month in 1944. At its peak in the spring of 1945, there were 300 working aircraft at Reeves Field. The airfield was first named Allen Field in 1927, but was renamed to honor Rear Admiral Joseph Reeves. Admiral Reeves was a dynamic sea captain and airplane pilot who was also an early proponent of aircraft carriers. After the war, Reeves Field was disestablished and military flights to Terminal Island ended in 1947. A Long Beach sports car club arranged a charity road race weekend on the Reeves Field grounds in October of 1953. Proceeds were donated to the Long Beach Navy Relief Benefit Fund. Fast and often exotic cars raced around a 2.3-mile course. The main event culminated with a 30-lap, 69-mile contest. 20 years later, in the 1970s, drag racing was allowed on the grounds and continued on and off for the next 2 decades. Construction of the naval dry docks entailed a massive engineering project and involved a number of complicated technical details. The first dry dock opened in the early 40s. It was named the Morrell Dock as a tribute to Rear Admiral Ben Morrell, Chief of the Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks, and also the father of the Navy Construction Battalion known as the Seabees. The Morrell Dry Dock was one of the largest in the Navy's arsenal. 2 smaller dry docks in the cruiser range complemented the larger one. The dry docks eventually were renamed the Long Beach Naval Shipyard and employed more than 16,000 civilian workers at the peak of operations in August of 1945. At war's end, the shipyard trimmed employees per government order, but experienced a ramping up of assigned work because of a program known as Magic Carpet. Magic Carpet was implemented to expedite the transition of warfighting ships to troop carriers in order to bring American servicemen home from the Pacific Theater. Additionally, as many as 70 older ships no longer needed in the arsenal were decommissioned and scrapped by the shipyard within a short time. New concerns emerged at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard in 1949. The federal government became alarmed at the rate of subsidence, or sinking, of the Long Beach shore caused by oil drilling in the harbor. While considering budget cuts, the Navy decided it would shutter the Long Beach shipyard. As a result, the shipyard was closed in early 1950, and a period of deactivation began whereby all equipment and heavy machinery were taken apart and stored for safekeeping. The deactivation process cost $4,859,294 in 1950 dollar value. But when North Korea invaded South Korea in that summer of 1950, the Pentagon changed its mind and decided the subsidence issue could be resolved later. The yard was reestablished. All the decommissioning and takedown work was reversed, and the shipyard reopened for business in early 1951 after an additional cost of $4,307,159 was incurred for reactivation efforts. The years of the 1950s were a time when the Navy sustained its strong relationship with the city of Long Beach. The Korean War stimulated Navy activity and shipyard work, which benefited the local economy. Although the number of sailors was down compared to the bustling years of World War II, there was ongoing engagement with the community at the Pike. Sailors spent time and money on amusement. The city continued to hold annual military balls and other dances which encouraged servicemen to spend evenings in Long Beach.
There were institutions in Long Beach like locker clubs and so on, and the Pike, and those places were popular with sailors. The locker clubs, because sailors couldn't wear civilian clothes off the ship in those days, so they would rent a locker at a locker club and keep their civilian clothes there, and then go and get off the ship, go there and change clothes, and go out on the town.
The Navy periodically presented demonstrations of tactics, naval strategy, and aquatic technology for the public and the news media. One such event was Operation Rainbow Week, held in January 1955. The public was invited to watch ship-to-shore maneuvers, a parade of assault vessels, minesweeping demonstrations, and searchlight activities. There were basketball games between Navy teams, with a local Miss Amphibian chosen to hand out trophies to the winners. Meanwhile, the city and the Port of Long Beach began hosting the first series of Miss Universe pageants from 1952 to 1959. Sailors who happened to be in town during those pageants certainly got an eyeful and were the envy of Navy crews on ships around the globe. In 1960, the Miss Universe pageant moved on to Miami, but Long Beach kept the same theme and renamed the annual event the International Beauty Congress. One of the notable features of Long Beach Roosevelt Base was its status as a major motion picture exchange for the forces afloat. Because of its proximity to Hollywood, the Long Beach base always had the latest films and the widest variety of motion picture selections for Navy ships. The vessels would load up on film reels before heading out on long voyages. A seagoing Arctic mission in 1954 requested and borrowed 140 new films. It was cold in the Arctic, and there wasn't much else to look forward to other than the occasional polar bear sighting. For purposes of entertaining sailors on land during World War II, Hollywood movies were shown 4 nights a week in the Roosevelt Base Auditorium. By the early 1960s, the base had built an actual movie theater which held about 938 seats. The local USO also arranged tours of Hollywood film and television studios for small groups of interested sailors with available Liberty shore leave. Civilians who were interested in public tours of Navy ships could visit on weekends in the 1960s and early 70s. Guided tours were routinely arranged for special clubs such as the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, as well as for school classes, church groups, and service organizations including the Daughters of Job and the Rainbow Girls. As part of the tour, lunch was offered at the base for the price of 70 cents. Those who partook experienced the finest in mess hall dining. In 1968, the General Mess Operation won third place in competition against all other large mess operations in the entire Navy. At the time, the station was responsible for support of 170 home-ported ships and vessels from the forces afloat. These ships comprised a population of 39,610 crew members. Facilities were provided for more than 50 shore-based activities. As part of these efforts, the Navy employed 12,575 civil service employees. About 61% of those employees, or a total of 7,710 civilian positions, were assigned to the Long Beach Naval Shipyard in support of ship repair, outfitting, and refurbishment. Shipyard payroll dollars amounted to $65 million a year, as the yard's employment periodically topped 8,000 in the late 60s. Recreation remained a key theme at the Long Beach Naval Station during the 1960s. Sports teams comprised a number of competitive activities for sailors based in Long Beach. Championship caliber teams were regular components of the athletics programs. The Islanders basketball team was a perennial contender in tournaments that decided the best of the best among the Navy. The softball and volleyball teams also did well, and swimmers were usually the top of the Navy's field. Flag football was popular on the base, and a competitive bowling team also was formed. A new 21-lane bowling alley in the 1960s complemented the original 6-lane alley built during World War II. After the Vietnam War, the Navy significantly reduced its presence in the San Pedro Bay and moved most of its ships to other naval stations, primarily San Diego. There would be one more, final resurgence in the Navy's presence in Long Beach. During the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan redirected a contingent of ships back to Long Beach as part of his strategy to rebuild and beef up the military force in general. However, the Long Beach Navy base was closed in the 1990s as part of the government's base realignment and closure process. The sailors were gone in the early 90s, but the shipyard remained open until 1997.
Well, I was privately shocked because of all the money that had been invested in Long Beach. I was shocked that they would turn around and close it. But of course, I couldn't share that publicly. The party line or the official position was, well, we support the Navy's decision and we'll carry it out.
From the beginning, the Long Beach Naval Shipyard developed an esprit de corps that translated into a can-do attitude. In the year between June 1944 and June 45, the shipyard prepared 367 vessels for sea duty through outfitting, upgrades, and repairs. There was an apprentice program during the war which recruited and trained high school boys in good academic standing. Boys could apply once they had reached the ripe old age of 16. The normal 4-year program was sped up during the war to facilitate completion in 27 months. Participants were paid to learn on the job. After the war, the program was restored to the 4-year completion plan for high school graduates.
And so after the apprenticeship, even after you became a journeyman mechanic, and you even kept learning as a journeyman, because now other apprentices are coming in and they assign an apprentice to you. Now you got to teach him what you learned. And so it's a matter of not just being a student of your trade, but being a master of your trade.
Some very memorable occasions in the shipyard occurred with both the Queen Mary and the Spruce Goose. the Queen Mary sailed into Long Beach amid great fanfare in December 1967. In early 1968, it was determined that the shipyard contained the best resources available for transforming the vessel into a permanently docked museum and hotel ship. One of the assignments was to create a glass-covered observation area, allowing tourists to look down at a bronze propeller. Regarding the Spruce Goose, Howard Hughes ignited the interest of the national press and thousands of curious onlookers in the Long Beach harbor on November 2, 1947. The long-awaited debut and maiden flight of his famous and controversial flying boat made history. The big bird spread its wings and flew for about a mile at approximately 70 feet above the water. More than 30 years later, when the time came to transport the Hercules flying boat across the harbor, once again it was determined that the shipyard possessed the only means available to get the job done. A gigantic floating crane was called into duty. The mammoth crane was known by its official designation as the YD-171 Titan. Unofficially, everyone called it Herman the German. Long Beach received it as one of the spoils of war around 1947. The YD-171 could handle the weight of the Hercules flying boat with relative ease. The 230,000 pounds of the big wooden flying machine were well within the weight capacity of Herman the German. During the 1980s, the shipyard became instrumental in the restoration and modernization of battleships many thought were headed to museum status or the nearest scrapyard. Two big ships restored in Long Beach were the New Jersey and the Missouri. They were similar in scope to the battleship Iowa, which is now a museum docked in San Pedro. The New Jersey and the Missouri found new life after renovations in the shipyard. Modern missile launching systems were added, updated electronics items were installed, and other operational upgrades rendered the ships proud again for their majestic sea duty.
I think every sailor and officer aboard felt a special sense of pride to be part of the New Jersey. There was pride in the ship's history, there was pride in the fact that we were battleship sailors, and everywhere we went, the people wanted to see the ship, they wanted to come aboard the ship, they just wanted to be part of it.
In May of 1905, Colonel Charles Rivers Drake was searching for a new attraction to open the tourist season at his beachfront amusement facility in Long Beach known as the Pike. He decided that a hot air balloon flying over the sand with a parachutist jumping out onto the beach would be a great dramatic hook for curiosity seekers. In the first two jumps, the parachute opened just in time to avert disaster. For Long Beach, the die was cast. The tempting lure of the clear blue sky with the deep blue sea and the beautiful beach below would inspire the imagination of daredevils, adventurers, competitors, entrepreneurs, and men and women who believed they were meant to be birds. In California, the first motor-driven flight in a machine heavier than air occurred over an Orange County lima bean field in August of 1909. The intrepid flyer was Glenn Martin, an eccentric Ford automobile salesman and machinist. Martin built his own biplane. He offered the passenger seat on this maiden voyage to the owner of the Irvine Ranch, James Irvine. Irvine politely declined, but several years later took to the air with Martin to soar like an eagle over his enormous ranch. Martin's first flight on that summer day rose 8 feet off the ground and stayed airborne for about 12 seconds. Glenn Martin would go on to establish numerous flight records, including the first round trip over the ocean to Catalina Island and back in 1912. The wooden propellers on Martin's first airplanes were designed and carved by Charles Day, a Long Beach bicycle shop owner. Martin started a small aircraft company in the Orange County city of Santa Ana and hired Charles Day as his chief engineer. When Day resigned a few years later, Glenn Martin hired a new chief design engineer by the name of Donald Wills Douglas. Martin could see the genius intellect and the passion for aeronautics in young Douglas, who was credited with designing the famous Martin bomber aircraft at the end of World War I. After a short time working together, Martin and Douglas went their separate ways. Both would eventually run large aircraft manufacturing companies during World War II. The highly productive Douglas plant in Long Beach became world famous. Southern California's general public had never seen an airplane in flight when the first international aviation meet in America was hosted at Dominguez Field. The open field was located about 5 miles from downtown Long Beach and near where the excavated cannon was fired during the Mexican-American War. January of 1910 marked the date of the heavily promoted American Aviation meet. A flamboyant Frenchman, Louis Paulhan, commanded the role of brightest star at the event. The charming and audacious Paulhan captivated the enthusiastic crowd with his mesmerizing light-as-a-feather maneuvers and graceful turns around a designated course. By the end of the 11-day meet, all of Southern California was hearing about the daring deeds of the bold men involved in this new phenomenon. In the end, Louis Paulhan dominated the headlines when he set a world record for soaring to an altitude of 4,164 feet. It was an unheard-of height at the time. For this achievement, the Los Angeles Times proclaimed Paulhan the hero of the world. The other featured flyer, American Glenn Curtiss, won the Speed Award for reaching 55 miles per hour while carrying a passenger. Many young men attended the meet with visions of grandeur in their minds. They included William Boeing, who would later found the Boeing Aircraft Company. Another young spectator was Jimmy Doolittle, who later became a famous pilot and led an American air raid over Japan early in World War II. William Randolph Hearst attended the meet at Dominguez Field and was taken up for his first airplane flight by Louis Paulhan. Hearst instinctively knew this aerial craze could be exploited to drive up newspaper readership. He offered a $50,000 prize for the first pilot who could fly across America coast to coast within a 30-day period. The journey would be difficult and treacherous because the aircraft available then were very flimsy and fragile. Nonetheless, a man of impressive pedigree stepped forward to attempt the challenge in September of 1911. He was Calbraith Perry Rogers. Rogers was the great-grandson of the famous Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry. Great-grandfather Commodore Perry was the U.S. naval commander who opened up the door of Japan and the Far East with his legendary Black Ships in 1854. Great-grandson Cal Perry Rogers began his aviation career with 90 minutes of instruction by the Wright brothers. Rogers convinced a food and beverage company to sponsor his cross-country aerial adventure. His airplane was built by the Wright brothers and was named the Vin Fizz to promote a new grape juice soft drink. Ultimately, it took Cal Rogers 7 weeks to fly from the New York coast to Southern California. The ever-confident and cigar-chomping pioneer experienced 15 crashes, suffered several broken bones, and had to repair the airplane constantly along the way. His landing in Pasadena in November 1911 consummated a coast-to-coast flight. However, with all of the crashes and repairs, the journey took about 49 days, well beyond the range of the Hearst prize money. Long Beach business leaders sensed a publicity opportunity, and the Chamber of Commerce offered Cal Rogers $1,000 to complete the flight to the Long Beach coast. However, his plane crashed in Compton a few miles from the Long Beach shore. He broke a leg bone and cracked some ribs.
It was a kind of a cartwheel across the country. He crashed his way from coast to coast, 15 crashes in all. The last one was in Compton.
After a few weeks of recuperation and repairing the aircraft, Rogers landed in Long Beach in front of more than 40,000 cheering admirers on December 10, 1911. He greeted his well-wishers while standing on crutches. Calbraith Perry Rogers became a national hero, upholding the honor of his famous family lineage. Rogers fell in love with Long Beach and continued flying over the city and landing on the beach for the next several months. Tragically, he conducted a difficult aerial maneuver and may have struck seagulls in early April of 1912, only 4 months after his historic achievement. His airplane crashed into the Long Beach surf one final time, and he was killed. Frank Champion was the first licensed pilot in Long Beach. He was the co-owner of a photography studio on the shorefront when he caught aviation fever from attending the first Dominguez Air Meet in January 1910. By February, the fever burned so hot that Champion left Long Beach and the photo studio to take flying lessons. Champion returned to Long Beach in the summer of 1911, by then an experienced and determined pilot. He quickly set an American speed record, flying from Dominguez Field to the Long Beach Pike in 4.5 minutes. Champion officially was clocked at 98 miles per hour, breaking the previous record of 78. For the next few years, he was renowned as the premier aviator of Long Beach. Among other accomplishments, Frank Champion set a record for flying from Oceanside, California to Long Beach in 55 minutes. Champion joined an international exhibition organization and built an aircraft in the basement of the 5-star Hotel Virginia. The craft was named the Long Beach Flyer. It was used to promote the city of Long Beach across the country. Sadly, Champion's career was cut short on a tour in the Far East. He wowed a crowd of 100,000 in Kochi, Japan, the morning of November 1, 1917. But in the afternoon, he was making a series of corkscrew maneuvers when the left wing broke away from his airplane. Champion plunged 4,000 feet to the ground and was killed. The entire population of Kochi turned out en masse for his funeral procession through the city. The Emperor of Japan further honored Frank Champion's memory by placing the engine from the crashed airplane on display in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Champion's friend and former student, Earl Doherty, would assume the role as the preeminent pilot in Long Beach. During World War I, Doherty became a flight instructor for Army aviators. He was stationed on North Island in San Diego and at March Field in Riverside. Doherty taught the inexperienced aviators the basics and then progressed to the evasion tactics that would enable them to participate in successful aerial combat against German enemy pilots. After the war ended, Doherty came back to Long Beach. He opened a flight school in 1919. He also bought and sold airplanes, often selling aircraft to his recent aviation graduates as part of a package deal. Doherty's entrepreneurial spirit for turning aviation into a commercial enterprise nearly matched his passion for piloting.
Earl did have the backing of his father, who had a photography studio on the beach, Charles. He was an only son, and so they also had a hotel, so he had a bit of money coming his way. I think his parents had a problem for him to find out what his calling in life was. And when he finally said it was aviation, good, he's finally made up his mind, this is what he wants to do.
As aviation fever spread across America, Doherty took advantage of the public's insatiable appetite for stunt flying and aerial circuses. Aeronautical tricks became the staple of barnstorming entertainment in the 1920s. Doherty's wing walkers became legendary for their mid-air stunts. He assembled a famous team of daredevils that included Wesley May, the most fearless of them all. Hollywood provided another incentive for these daring demonstrations. The motion picture industry in Southern California was still in its infancy when aerial stuntmen provided an extra lure for box office sensationalism. Long Beach was home to one of the largest movie studios during the early silent film era. Fatty Arbuckle, Jackie Saunders, and Buster Keaton were three of the prominent movie stars filmed at the Long Beach-based Balboa Studios. Having ready access to fearless flyers in Long Beach provided grist for the Hollywood and Balboa Studios production mills. In December of 1920, Long Beach hosted a national winter air tournament. Earl Doherty helped arrange and promote the event, which attracted many thousands of spectators, including 23-year-old Amelia Earhart. One day after she witnessed the air show, a pilot and associate of Earl Doherty named Frank Hawks took the nervous but enthusiastic Amelia on board for her very first flight. About 6 days later, she took her first flying lesson. As aviation became more popular and the skies more crowded over Long Beach, Earl Doherty embarked on a campaign to get the city to establish and operate a municipal airfield. In 1923, the Long Beach City Council acquiesced to Doherty's request and agreed to designate a portion of city land as the location for a permanent municipal airfield. Although he was the most prominent and influential aviator in Long Beach, Doherty faced challenges in his career. He was sued at least twice for collision incidents near the ground. Doherty also experienced several potentially devastating mid-air calamities. In one situation, a wooden propeller broke into pieces while his airplane was about 500 feet aloft. He was able to glide the craft down to a soft landing. Another accident resulted when an engine failure occurred. Doherty crash-landed from 50 feet above the earth, suffering a broken tooth and jaw damage as well as multiple bruises. On December 8, 1928, fate finally would catch up with 41-year-old Earl S. Doherty. He was flying a new airplane with two prominent passengers along for the ride. One of the passengers was Warren Montfort, city editor of the Long Beach Press-Telegram newspaper. After conducting a barrel roll, the wings on one side broke apart and separated. The plane was helpless and began a nosedive from above 3,000 feet. The front end of the aircraft burrowed 5 feet into the ground upon impact. All 3 men were killed instantly. The entire city of Long Beach went into shock. John Montiel was one of Earl Doherty's friends and a fellow pilot serving on the early Long Beach Aviation Commission. Doherty met Montiel while the two were standout flight instructors at both Rockwell Field, San Diego, and March Field in Riverside during World War I. As a barnstorming pilot, Montiel attracted the attention of the Samuel Goldwyn Movie Studio and performed stunt flying tricks with the cameras rolling. He also served briefly as a private pilot for William Randolph Hearst, routinely flying the newspaper magnate from Los Angeles to the castle at San Simeon. He settled in Long Beach to design and build aircraft featuring an enclosed cabin that enabled aviators to fly without enduring the wind in their faces. As a general flight instructor, John Montiel taught Amelia Earhart how to meticulously maneuver through aerobatic stunts, and he also gave her the confidence to solo. In the mid-1930s, Montiel began flying an airmail route for Varney Air Transport, which later became United Airlines. Montiel's route from Pueblo, Colorado to El Paso, Texas, involved a regular mail drop over a remote school near Walsenburg, Colorado. On May 1, 1935, as he prepared to drop a letter to the school children, a fierce gust of wind lifted his plane's left wing at about 150 feet above ground. John Montiel's engine stalled and his plane crashed. He was killed while in service to the always admiring school children he had never forgotten on the airmail route. Aviator Frank Hawks flew to Southern California from a job in South America to honor Montiel's funeral procession. Hawks was part of a 20-pilot contingent that flew low over the slow procession, dropping flowers all along the way. Frank Hawks and John Montiel had long memories with their mutual friend, Earl Doherty. Hawks was hired by Doherty to be an airplane mechanic for $35 a week following World War I. Shortly after, Hawks linked up with daredevil wingwalker Wesley May, and the two went on a barnstorming campaign. Eventually, Earl Doherty lured both of them back to the fold in Long Beach. the three worked together on a special stunt involving the first in-flight refueling in November of 1921. The stunt featured Wesley May climbing between two airplanes with a gas can. Frank Hawks would go on to become the most famous aviator from Long Beach after Doherty's death. He was known as a speed flyer and held 214 point-to-point records. In February of 1929, Hawks set a new transcontinental record for flying from Burbank to New York in 18 hours and 21 minutes. He was a national celebrity in 1937 when he starred in a 15-episode movie serial titled The Mysterious Pilot. He was also endorsing and promoting a popular breakfast cereal.
And he was quite a promoter. He even had little medals that were put in cereal boxes, and you could join the Frank Hawks Aviation Club and wear your little medal around.
Tragically, his famous career was abruptly terminated in 1938. Near Buffalo, New York, Hawks attempted a crosswind takeoff. His airplane became entangled with power lines, ultimately setting the craft on fire. Frank Hawks died at age 41, the same age at which his friend and one-time boss, Earl Doherty, had died. Eerily enough, another pilot they both knew well, Amelia Earhart, was declared dead officially after missing for 18 months in the South Pacific. At the time of the official declaration, Amelia would have been 41 years old. About a month before Frank Hawks was killed in the 1938 accident near Buffalo, Long Beach again made international aviation news. Douglas Corrigan flew from Long Beach to New York City nonstop in a rickety, makeshift 1929 aircraft with a second-hand engine and a door held together by baling wire. As an aircraft mechanic in San Diego, Corrigan had participated in the assembly of Lindbergh's famous airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. He often skipped lunch in order to save the $310 he needed to buy his own used airplane. On the flight that would make him a household name, Douglas Corrigan departed New York, telling everyone he was flying back to Long Beach. However, he headed east instead of west and flew over the cold Atlantic for 28 hours before touching down in Dublin County, Ireland. For this feat of opposite directionality, he was forever named Wrong Way Corrigan. He claimed that a broken compass and extremely cloudy weather prevented him from knowing which direction he was flying. Most people assumed he deliberately planned the solo adventure all along in homage to his hero, Charles Lindbergh. Eventually, Corrigan returned to Long Beach in triumph. He took advantage of his new fame, endorsing products and writing an autobiography which became a Hollywood movie. He starred in the film as himself. His daring adventure brought him about $85,000 in total revenue, considered a king's ransom during the Depression. Wrong Way Corrigan was a test pilot for Douglas Aircraft during World War II. He tried politics unsuccessfully after the war and settled down with his family on an orange grove in Santa Ana. He lived out his life at the farmhouse until old age claimed him in 1995. The Lone Eagle aviator who had inspired Corrigan on his crazy wrong way journey landed at Long Beach several times. One of those times, Lucky Lindy Lindbergh touched down late on a dark night in May of 1928. He parked his airplane next to Lloyd O'Donnell's flight school at the Long Beach airport. As morning arrived, O'Donnell couldn't help himself and started taking people up in the plane for $60 a ride without asking Lindbergh's permission. In spite of Lloyd's bravado, it was his wife, Gladys O'Donnell, who would become the celebrated aviation star of the family. Gladys was a 25-year-old housewife with 2 children when she became one of the first licensed female pilots in Long Beach in May of 1929. 3 months after acquiring her license, Gladys O'Donnell entered the first Women's National Air Derby, competing against the biggest names in aviation, including Amelia Earhart and Florence Pancho Barnes. The race began in Santa Monica and ended in Cleveland, Ohio. Humorist Will Rogers titled the race the Powder Puff Derby, a name which stuck for many years. 20 women pilots entered. Gladys O'Donnell managed to finish in second place, beating Amelia Earhart, who finished third. Gladys was given a heroine's welcome back home. The following year, in 1930, Long Beach hosted the start of the second annual Powder Puff race. This time, Gladys O'Donnell won, arriving in first place from Long Beach to Chicago. After the war, aviatrix Fran Barra, who operated a flight school in Long Beach, won the race a record 7 times. Another Long Beach aviatrix, Barbara Erickson London, routinely participated in transcontinental air races. Previously, she was the squad commander of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots Group in Long Beach during World War II. Because of her extraordinary ferrying accomplishments, Barbara Erickson was the only woman pilot honored during the war with the prestigious Air Medal Award. In addition to serving as a major in the U.S. Air Force Reserve for 20 years, Barbara Erickson London also became a board member for the Powder Puff Derby Association. When Donald Wills Douglas gripped a gold-plated shovel to turn the dirt in Long Beach on November 22, 1940, it was the dawn of the local aircraft manufacturing industry on a massive scale. Intended as a wartime production plant, the doors were opened to the public in October 1941 for a first look at the new facility. More than 42,000 employees, many of them women, operated the rivet guns and the other tools that rendered the plant one of the most productive on the West Coast. After the war, the Douglas Company continued to build military aircraft in Long Beach and also developed a commercial line. The plant merged with the McDonnell Company of St. Louis in 1967, becoming McDonnell Douglas Corporation. In the early 1990s, the Long Beach factory continued to employ up to 35,000 workers, producing military jets as well as commercial airliners. In 1997, the facility was taken over by Boeing in a corporate merger. But Donald Douglas was not the first to turn the dirt on an aircraft manufacturing plant in the city of Long Beach. Almost exactly 4 years to the day prior to when Douglas wielded the ceremonial shovel, dirt was turned by predecessors on November 25, 1936 at the Long Beach Municipal Airport. The 1936 groundbreaking started construction for a new factory unit of the Security National Aircraft Corporation. Security Aircraft was a company founded by Bert Kenner. Kenner was a self-taught mechanic with an 8th grade education. As a young man in Iowa and Minnesota, he was known as the kid who could fix anything. In 1929, Bert Kenner's aircraft engines were used by 49 small aircraft manufacturing companies and 82 flight schools. 8 years earlier, in 1921, he raced his signature Airster aircraft against Frank Hawks and Earl Doherty. Amelia Earhart witnessed the race and was suitably impressed with the Airster's performance. She bought an Airster model as her first airplane for $2,000. It was painted bright yellow, and so she called it a Canary. Amelia's first flight instructor was Anita Snook, a pilot, operations manager, and occasional mechanic working for Bert Kenner. John Montiel also was working with Kenner when he taught Amelia how to perform aerobatic stunts. Bert Kenner was a creative visionary in aircraft design. He continued to re-engineer and upgrade the Airster into the 1930s. The Airster S-1A featured patented fold-up wings that significantly reduced storage space requirements. Today, the Long Beach Airport is one of the busiest in the nation for general aviation, including commercial aircraft, corporate and private planes, flight training schools, and police helicopter surveillance operations. JetBlue has designated Long Beach as an important focus city for West Coast air travel. Those who fly in and out of Long Beach today are fulfilling a prophecy issued in 1928 by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Williams of the U.S. Naval Reserve. Long Beach is no longer at the end of the trail. It is at the beginning of limitless air voyages of intriguing interest. The Long Beach Municipal Airport will be a mecca for the pilgrims of the blue, vaulted heights of the heavens. It is this magic realm that the airport opens to the pilots of the summer skies. Indeed, the lure of the azure sea, the endless blue sky, and the crescent-shaped shoreline has attracted many to the former queen of the beaches. The city beckoned, enchanted, and revealed them all for who they were: the dreamers, the industrialists, the daredevils, the sailors, and the working men and women who built the city and its enterprises from the ground up. Success came for those who were fortunate, and for those whose fate was tragic. The city cried a collective tear many times in this land of God-given natural beauty. Long Beach, California,